Tonight we will work on bringing the Photoshop file into Flash so we can understand that part of the workflow process and then begin animating it and see what some of the differences are that we encounter when we're animating Photoshop or bitmap artwork versus natively created Flash content. The Flash file that the Photoshop file that you have been provided is broken into a series of named layers. So we can see there's a torso layer, there's a leg, and there's another leg, and there's an arm and a head and a hand and a hand. And the more control you want over an animation while you're working on it, the more pieces you need to break it into. If you want to make the arms or legs bend at the elbows or knees, you need to separate those into individual pieces as well. Figure this is enough parts to begin with tonight, so that's what we'll work with. So this is the Photoshop file. Now as I'm going to work in Flash, I am going to begin tonight by creating a new document. Should always make the first activity you do is save your document. So you should save it before you begin doing anything further. So I am naming mine and saving it. One of the things that is present in Flash is there is a built-in auto recovery that it will by default attempt to save every 10 minutes. That seems like a great idea on the surface. It's like, wow, wonderful. So when it crashes, my file's been saved. That's wonderful. Microsoft products do that by default in the background, so while you're working, Word will end up trying to save what you're doing, and it's great. Except that in Flash, sometimes the saving process can, when your file gets pretty long and complicated, it may not save in a timely manner. It may take enough time to save that you're doing something and suddenly the whole program seizes up and you're like, oh my gosh, it crashed, what's going on? And you start freaking out, and no, it's just trying to save. So my preference while I'm working in Flash is I always deselect that. And I then force myself to save on my own. So I'm also going to change the screen chrome on mine to make it a little bit easier to see some of the things in the recording by making it lighter on screen. You don't need to lighten your chrome, but I would say turn off auto recovery because that's a better way of working. Now that I have my document saved and ready to go, I'm going to modify the size of my document. And I will make it choosing 960 by 500, a nice good widescreen. You can choose whatever proportion you want. You can get a nice 16 by 9 proportion. You can go for a letterbox, or you can choose a banner ad shape. It's up to you. It's your project. You can determine your size. I like the extreme aspect ratios of the more rectangular canvas. So now what I need to do is I need to bring my Photoshop file in so I have something to animate. And to do that, I go under my File pull-down menu and I will find that there's an option of Import to Stage or Import to Library. When we are importing audio files, we import them to the library. That's the only option we really have for an audio file. When we are importing artwork, we could choose to import it to the library, and knowing that later on we will be adding it to our stage. But if we're bringing in a layered document like the Photoshop file, it's easier to bring it to the stage now because it can maintain the registration of all of our layers. So I would prefer or recommend that would be your course of action. So we choose Import to Stage. And then we navigate to the file and we can go grab the PSD. You can bring in JPEGs, PNGs, GIFs, and PSDs, AI files, and I'm sure there's other ones. Most of the time, you bring in a PNG, a JPEG file, or a PSD file. That's the most common ones. AI files sometimes get quirky. I haven't experimented with CC 2014 to know, are the issues between Illustrator and Flash still there? They used to be problematic. I don't know if they still are. So I'll choose Open. And now it gives me a window. And when this window comes up, we'll notice that I have an option to match my stage to that Photoshop file, which was really big. Or I can convert my Photoshop layers to Flash layers. I can convert them to keyframes. So it could take my layers that I would have. Those layers could actually be frames of an animation. And I could now have those layers become frames in my Flash timeline. If it has text layers, so if my Photoshop file had text layers, I could choose to keep those text layers editable even when I bring them into Flash, so it doesn't just convert them to shapes. That would be an option. We could also choose to flatten the Photoshop file into just a flat image. If I was doing that, I would have optimized it in Photoshop and saved it out as a PNG before bringing it in the first place, versus having Flash do it. So the default we want to go with is we'll maintain Flash layers, and we're going to then have to resize our artwork so that it does fit onto our current size stage, because my stage is 500 pixels tall, the image is 3200 pixels tall, so it's going to take a little scale action there. Not a big deal. We can scale artwork on multiple layers, no problem. I can say OK, and it's really big. So we can see it's now really big. It's transformable using the free transform tool. If you grab the free transform tool, 3 tools down in your toolbar, you will see that you can now scale the artwork. I would encourage you to think very strongly about holding down the Shift key while you're doing it so that your artwork maintains its proportion. That way the artwork is going to be consistent in its size as you bring it in. So it's not going to scale it in a disproportionate manner. Now if I click off, I will see there it is. And I will also notice when I look down in my timeline, I will see that each one of my layers, name and all, came in from Photoshop. Now that all of the artwork has been brought into the program, we can see each part is on its own layer. I can turn off all the layers. I can turn on the layers. So it gives me something to work with. Now if we want to animate these layers across the screen or do something with them, the best way to do that is to do some type of motion tweening with them. We can't do shape tweens as we saw last week because that only works with shapes or paths that are created inside the program. But if I go here, we'll notice that the only option I have is motion tween. I don't have an option for a shape tween because you can't morph or modify the pixels in the program. If I make a layer in Flash, that layer in Flash now, that is a shape. That is a path that is defined as a mathematical path with points. So if I'm going to do a shape tween, what it does is it says go from this path to some other path. I'm going to have to go here and shape tween. And now at this point, so I would say I could go from my starting path here to my ending path here, and it's corresponding point to point, saying, okay, line point A up with point B, point C up with point D. So now it knows this point there corresponds to this point here. So a shape tween is about going from these, from a path to a path. That's how the program is actually able to do a shape tween. So if you bring in a picture A picture is a series of pixels. It's not a path. It doesn't have points that we can work with. I don't need the shape tween layer. We'll look at doing shape tween some more later. So now what I want to do is I want to start animating some of these objects. So if I want to animate, say, this arm so that the arm can rotate, I probably won't want to rotate it around the elbow. I may wish to rotate it instead from its shoulder area. But to do that, what we first are going to want to do is we will want to take these layers, and if we are going to motion tween them, if I right click and initially we're trying to use classic tweens as much as possible. So if I say classic tween on it, it ends up making a tween. It makes the object into a tween object. And if we look here, it'll say tween 1. Then when I go to the next item here, or let's see, right here, create classic tween. So we end up with all of these tween 1, tween 2, tween 3, and then I look in my library, and the organizational side of me, the little bit that is there, is really bothered by that. So I'm going to say I don't want to do that. So I'm going to just undo that. Keep going until those tweens are gone. Where are those tweens? All right. So to animate this, what we want to do is we want to convert each one of these objects into a symbol. And we're able to convert the objects into a symbol by hitting F8 on the keyboard or right-clicking on them and choose Convert to Symbol. When I choose Convert to Symbol, we have 3 kinds of symbols available to choose from. We have movie clip, button, and graphic. There's pros and cons to using a movie clip versus a graphic. If we are building something that has its own internal timeline, so it's going to animate inside of that, such as like someone walking, a bird flapping its wings, or a light that's flashing and blinking, we may wish to use a graphic so we can see that timeline play on the main timeline. If we choose movie clip, we have some additional properties that movie clips have, so we can apply filters to them. So we can put glows, inner glows and outer glows, and blurs and drop shadows and all kinds of cool things on movie clips that we can't do to a graphic. So if we don't have time inside of time, so if we're not animating the timeline to this asset in addition to animating it on the main timeline, I would recommend go ahead and just use a graphic, or I mean a movie clip. Because the movie clip, once I select that, and I forgot to name it, then this would be right arm. If I look under properties, I will see that because it's a movie clip, I have options. I can apply colors to it. I can change how it's being displayed. I can even now apply filters. So I have drop shadow, blur, glow, adjust its color. So these are all filters that I can apply, and the filters themselves are actually tweenable. So we can animate filters as well, which is really cool. So we can animate blurs and other things. So if you think from a cinematography standpoint, you can put something on screen, and then if it's a movie clip, you can animate it in and out of focus by applying a blur filter to it. It's kind of a cool effect. So what I'm going to do is go through my different parts. So now this is going to be my torso, and I will just hit F8, turn that into a movie clip, F8, and I will just continue that till all of my parts are named. With all of the layers now converted into symbols, so I have head, arm, hands and legs, and arms and torso. So I have all of my different symbols ready to work with here. Now that I'm doing that, I can start trying to animate them and work with them. What would be easiest is to just tell all of these layers right now I want to turn you into motion tween layers, and I can start animating this. Because currently this shows up for 1/24th of a second. That's all my movie is 1/24th of a second. So if I hit run, there's not a lot to see. And just stay zoomed out so I can see. Your screens are big enough, you probably don't have to zoom out as far as I do to be able to see everything and have space in which to work. So if I want to take this puppet that we're going to be working with and animating it, what we can do is we can now take all of the layers that I have here and select them. Now if I click on the first layer and drag downward, that selects all the layers. If I click on the first layer and then hold down Shift, that selects all the layers. If I want to select a group of layers that are not in order, if I hold the Command key in the keyboard, I can choose layers individually without selecting all of them. So Shift clicking is probably the fastest way to do it, or click and drag. If I right click, I can see I have an option for Classic Tween or Motion Tween. So if I choose Classic Tween on here, all of these layers have now become tweened layers. When we extend them out, we will see they're no longer gray, but they take on a nice kind of lavender, periwinkle blue kind of color. So if I want this now to be on for 1 second, I'll go out to 24 frames and hit F5 on the keyboard to extend it out. Now, I will notice that all of these layers have a dot pattern on them. On a properly tweened layer, you go from a keyframe, the black circle, you see a line with an arrow on it, and then you have your ending frame. The reason these are dotted is because they do not have an ending keyframe, so we're not tweening between them yet. We turn them into tween layers. They're nice and purpley blue, but we need that ending keyframe. And to put in that ending keyframe, I can now just hit F6 on the keyboard and we get a keyframe. Now if I want this arm to move or rotate, the transform tool is what I would use. And if you put your cursor near the end, you will notice how you get the curl showing up next to the transform, indicating now it's going to rotate. Again, it's not rotating in the right place. And we can modify where it rotates by changing our registration point. And I can drag this point right here, this white circle. That changes the registration point. So now it animates based on that. So what I would encourage you to do is to now play with this a little bit and experiment what happens when we move things. Now, part of the thing that you will notice is the hand and arm aren't moving together. But if I want to move them as a group, I can now select them both and modify the point that they are now animating on, and we will see that, oh, except I screwed up, well, previously on one of them. So I'm rescinding one thing that I mentioned before. Before we add in the ending keyframes to our tweens, what we want to do is on each one of our layers, we want to set what we want that registration point to be, because it will remember it when we go from keyframe to keyframe. So if I set my pivot points in the beginning, then I will be much happier down the road. Because after I have set all of those pivot points, now if I take my arm and hand when I choose to animate the arm now will give me a smooth animation. You will also notice that the arm is in front of the torso, so we see how overlap is occurring. We may decide that we want the torso in front of body parts, the head on top of that, and we can adjust our layering by we can adjust all of our layers by the order in which they are drawn on screen. Now the torso, because my torso had the junk in it that I mistakenly did not delete, when I'm trying to click past it, you will notice that it's in the way. I can get the hand, but I can't get the arm. Can't get the arm. Can only get the hand when I'm past the torso. But what you can do is you can lock a given layer. I lock that layer. And it's not a bad idea when you're animating. You lock all layers that you are not currently manipulating so you don't screw something up. Picture this. You have 10 layers for one character, 10 layers for another character. You have 10 or 20 layers for the background. When you start trying to click on things, it's really easy to grab the wrong layer. So it's recommended you lock layers that you are not currently working with. So now if I unlock the head, I can go to the head and decide that I want the head to tilt to the side so we can see how it moves. Now if I want to go find that hand, that's my right hand over here, I can pull the hand down. So we'll see we're starting to create a puppet. Now, through doing this, it requires you to pay attention to how things are moving. Do we have perfect control over everything? Only if you're willing to put in enough keyframes. If you do enough keyframes, everything lines up perfectly. The recognized reality is that what we're doing will have that it's more than good enough. We get it close. At the end of the day, you need to get to the end of the time that you're supposed to be animating. The recommendation will be get there. Then add in more polish, add in more features, add in more layers, and make it better. But if at the end of the day you have failed to achieve the minimum, you have failed to achieve the minimum. So the first step is to make sure that you are going to cross the finish line with the required minimum amount of content, the 30 seconds of animation that we will be looking for. Now, if I lock everything but the torso, now I can go grab a leg here and decide said leg is going to animate out. So now we can see leg goes out. I want this leg to drop underneath a little bit. But after doing that, as the leg goes out, what I want to have happen at the end here, and it will make more sense in just 1 second. If I use onion skinning to my advantage, and select everything, what you will see that I've done is I've now created a whole body movement. So you can animate individual pieces. I think the head needs to rotate the other way. That would just make more sense. So as the body is going over, the head rolls. So if you notice, the weight is shifting onto that 1 foot. And in doing so, the leg is shifting out, came down. So now I can decide, okay, there's 1 second. Let's go out another second. At this point I could just hit F6 and extend it out. Everything is now selected. Let's say I shift it to the side if I want to now decide that it's going to go up. And now lock the torso because it's causing no end of headache. And then go through and animate the pieces. Now what you will find is the process of doing this is you move parts and then you move through time. Now I'm doing full second jumps. You may decide a half second or a quarter second is the most you can move to get the keyframes that you need. Depends on your artwork. I'm kind of wishing this character had knees so I could do a better jump. But now that it's moving like this, if I test my movie and look at it, we'll see it comes up. And 1 second, 2 seconds. So it's kind of slow. So I think I'm going to need to tweak the timing a little bit because I like it more with the snappier timing. The good part is when you have a keyframe, you can move it. You can just select keyframes, select whole groups of keyframes, and now I can move them over and decide, well, I want it to go much faster. Select my keyframes. I want them to go much faster. Now if I watch my movie, I think that's better. Question has come up of how can you, now that my artwork is on the stage here, so we have everything, it's extending, and I'm just going to take everything, unlock the torso, select it all again, pull it down. So I float down to earth like an angel or some such nonsense. But if I wanted to take my entire animation of this character and move it and work with it across time, something is happening on this set of keyframes, these keyframes, and if I have individual layers doing things and they have their own keyframes. So that's a lot of stuff to work with. But there is an option in the program called Edit Multiple Frames. So it's down at the bottom. It's the second small icon to the right of onion skinning, and if I click on that, it gives me a slider that I can choose what frames I want to multiply or edit. And now we will see how it shows me all of my artwork on all of my keyframes. So if I select everything, we can see that's a lot of items that are selected. So that's every keyframe of leg, every keyframe of torso, every keyframe of head and arm and hand and other leg. But if I do that and now pull this over here, what we will see, well, if I turn it back off temporarily, we'll see that my entire animation now takes place over here. But if I do it again, where I turn on Edit Multiple Frames and again select everything, with the Transform tool, I can now take my entire animation, and at every point in time it's now been shrunk down. So if the artwork that I was working with was too big, or if it's in the wrong place on stage, you can now select multiple layers, multiple frames, and move them around as you need to. It's pretty cool. So that's an extremely powerful feature that you can work with. So a question of dealing with, say, an embedded timeline or a timeline within a timeline. So currently I have the head, and the head is a movie clip. If we double click on the head, we will see that we've now entered into its timeline. Our other layers have now disappeared. We see we were at scene 1, we're now inside the head symbol. Inside this symbol, I now have my head layer. If I were to add another layer, I'm just going to grab my paintbrush and I'm going to draw a red line here, and then I'm going to hit F6, not F6, sorry, F7 to extend it out. I do want to turn on onion skinning so I can see what I was doing. And I'm going to animate this line so that it appears to be circling my head. Now if I turn off onion skinning and scrub this timeline, we'll see how now this is circling on the head. If I put on looping and watch it in its entirety and hit the play button down at the bottom, we'll see how it creates the illusion of now I have time. So I've done frame by frame animation, but now I have a symbol that is animating inside my main movie. We can turn that off. If we go back to scene 1, we can see, okay, there it is. Now when I scrub my timeline, one of the things you will notice is we don't get to actually see it animate just yet. We only get to see it when we publish or test our movie. This is one of the disadvantages of using a movie clip object versus using a drawing symbol-based object. If something is a drawing object, so that when you are creating symbols, you have options of a graphic or drawing object, I called it, but it's a graphic symbol, a button symbol, or a movie clip. If you choose a graphic symbol, its timeline will be linked to the main timeline so that it can show you that internal timeline. A movie clip does not. It's just part of the kind of quirks of the system. But now if I go and watch my movie inside where it's being published, we'll see how that is now moving around. So now I've animated my symbol, but that symbol has its own timeline of animation occurring. Now it's having just a single element animated like that. It's not uncommon to reuse all of these pieces, so that I would say make a character walking or jumping and then animate that as a single symbol across the stage versus animating all of these things. Because if you know it's a repeating action like running, like walking, or something like that, it's far easier to put that into a symbol and then just animate that. So I am going to create a new symbol, and this symbol will be a graphic, so it's easier for me to work with, and I'm going to call it walking. And I'm going to do the best to make my character walk from a frontal point of artwork, but I want to walk sideways across the stage, so it's going to be a real interesting appearance when it's all done. So when I make a new symbol, we'll notice that I have a brand new empty timeline. If I go over to my library, we'll see that now that symbol is there. We can see that symbols are identified by the type of symbol they are. Movie clip symbols have the little gear icon on them, and a graphic symbol has the circle, square, triangle on it. So they have that identifying characteristic as part of it. Now, as part of this, what I want to do is I'm going to put all of these elements on screen here. Now we'll notice that it looked, whoa, wrong tool. That things are kind of not really in any type of position or alignment, and it's all on one layer, which isn't really useful either. When you have a bunch of symbols on one layer, it's possible to right click and you have an option to distribute to layers. So a bunch of objects on one layer, we can distribute them to separate layers, and we'll now see that that grouping of layers now appeared. And that layer I no longer need, I'll throw that out. So we have our different layers, torsos on the bottom, so I can just set the torso here and start lining parts up in relation to what we're working with. And you may notice at certain times I will have to juggle some of the layers around because it looks like then the hands are behind the arms, and I want the hands in front of the arms. So we can now take the right hand and put it up here. We'll take the left hand and put it up there. So now the hands are front. So you can change the order of layers just by dragging. Just like in any other layer-based software, you just drag your layers and they change. It's a very friendly process, and we don't get, usually don't get too intimidated by that part of it. Okay, so now that I have these, again, before we start animating, I can start clicking on my layers and setting my registration points so when I do start tweening things, it's going to line up and make it easier for me. So this is just a little piece of housekeeping that's good to pull off in the beginning. So now I have my registration points set up, that over as well. And I can now take my layers, highlight, create classic tween, and I'm going to go out about 10 frames, close enough, hit F6, and now I have them ready to animate. Let's see. Move a leg over there. Now it's just going to be a matter of so what I want to create is starting to walk in place, almost like being on a treadmill. I feel like eventually I'll have to go back and figure out something for the arms, but the frontal artwork is just very disturbing for this. Here. Now another thing we can do to help with the animation is you can copy frames. So I'm going to highlight frames, choose copy, then I will go over here Choose paste frame. So that makes now my beginning and ending frames the same. Let's put this on loop and see just how bad it's starting to look. Oh. All right. It'll work. Now, if you're trying to have someone walk it really in, sideways, have the artwork sideways. That'd work better. But I'm doing a weird sidestep. Now that I have it, I'm going to tweak the timing a little bit and pretty much cut it in half. And I'm just highlighting frames, highlighting keyframes, I should say, and move them over until I start to get, I think, a little better timing with it. And then to get rid of frames, I can highlight frames, right-click, and choose Remove Frames. F5 adds frames, Shift F5 takes away. So now if I hit play, okay. So now we got a little dance action going here. It's kind of fun. And stop. Okay, so here's my main movie. If I add a new layer, if I take my walking symbol, put it on screen. Remember, I didn't shrink this one like the, I edited all those frames so they're smaller. So now, if this is here, let's start so the hand starts on screen. Create a tween. Go to the end of time. F5, sorry, F6. That over here. So now I have my animated sequence going across. Okay, that's almost funny. But if I decide that it needs to be longer or shorter, I can always stretch it out, slow it down. Now we can go preview the entirety of the movie. So I've recycled the same pieces of artwork, put it in twice, and now I've been able to get it to animate on screen. If I add a new layer, we can see now my movie is 65 frames long. When I add a new layer, it is automatically 65 frames long. So if I want my artwork to be here, but I don't want that to show up until frame 45, don't start drawing when the keyframe is in frame 1. You need to put a keyframe at the frame you want it to appear. So if I want it to be at frame 45, I click on frame 45, then I insert a keyframe, and then I start drawing. Because otherwise, when your movie gets to be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 800, 900 frames long, you add a new layer, it's the length of your movie. So you need to then put a starting keyframe where you want that artwork to show up. Otherwise, everything will always begin at 1. So if you don't want it to begin at 1 when you add a new layer, so I'm going to extend this layer out to frame 135. So when I add a new layer, that layer is now 135 frames long. So if I want my sidestepping self to show up at frame 74, I add a keyframe at 74, then I put my artwork on stage. If I want that artwork to disappear at frame 102 or 3, then I insert an empty keyframe after that artwork to make it go away. That now terminates that layer. So we punctuate a layer with an empty keyframe saying, I no longer want you around. That's the way to handle that. So when your project grows, you insert a keyframe at the point you want your artwork to now show up on screen. When you are done with the artwork on that layer, you insert an empty keyframe after it. F7. That will make it go away. Otherwise, you'll add a new layer and it shows up and it starts where you want, but now it's suddenly you can't get rid of it. Add that empty keyframe, it goes away. Adding sound to our projects requires you to have a sound file to add. So I know I do have a downloaded file. MP3s work great. WAV files work great provided they're saved at CD quality or less. If they're saved at DVD quality, they will not work. AIFF files, again, CD quality or lower quality. So 44, 100 hertz, 16-bit, or lower quality. Otherwise, the file will not work. So if you have really great audio, don't bring it in. Bring it at least down to CD quality. So sound goes in our library. So even if you hit import to stage, the sound will go in the library. So it's not a big deal to just hit Command R to import it. So now I need to navigate to a sound file, and I know that I do have a sound file hiding in this folder, so I'm just going to go grab that one for now. It's an MP3 file. And I'll bring it in, and there it is. And if I look at my timeline, nothing has changed. Nothing has appeared on my timeline, but if I look in my library, I will see that there is now a sound file in my library. It's not in my timeline, it's in my library. The way to think about sound, sound is a property of a frame. So we don't drag sound to our stage or anything. We are going to use frames. We'll click on keyframes and we will click in the property panel. So property is up next to library. And it's highly suggested, a best practice, you make a layer, call it music, audio, sound, or whatever you want. Give it a name so you know what it is. You don't put any artwork on this layer. You can even lock it and still add the keyframes and add sound to it without having to unlock it. So you make that audio layer, and it doesn't matter whether the audio layer is at the top of the stack or the bottom of the stack. We don't see it, so it's not a visual layer. So if I want my sound to start playing at frame 1, I click on the keyframe at frame 1. Now in my property panel it says frame, and I will see one of my tabs there is sound. I can click under where it currently says none, and now I can choose my music. Now we can see here's the sound, and it's ready to go. One of the disadvantages of working in the canvas mode of Flash is that we have less control of our sound, so that we can't make the sound scrubbable. So we have to start paying attention to what are we seeing based on certain demarcations in time. That's one of the disadvantages. But if I now take this and test my movie, Command Return or Command Enter on the keyboard, it launches it in my web browser. And we can see now the sound is playing. Now one of the things that happened right there, you may have noticed that the sound got a little weird because the sound played itself, but by the time my movie went back to its beginning and looped and played again, it started playing the sound a second time. And it started playing the sound a third time. It started playing the sound a fourth time. And every time it looped, it started a new copy of the sound. When you're playing a full-on long piece of sound, you won't get back to the beginning. It doesn't matter. It's fine. But if you have a short little thing like a web banner that's looping and you throw a little bit of sound in, that could be problematic. So you would have to then add in some scripting to try and control it. For now, we're not going to worry about that. Upcoming classes, we will give you some more tools to work with this. So right now we can put the sound in and start to see what is happening with it and start to see that sound. Now remember, you could always open the sound in a sound editor, pay attention to moments in time of when you want key events to happen. When you are working in Flash, if besides doing the math of, okay, well, what you know what frame number you're on. So I'm on frame 44 right now, but we can also see that I'm at 1.8 seconds. Down at the very bottom of the screen, it tells you where are you in time. So even though I keep saying this is a frame-based program, it does understand the concept of time roughly. So you can now make notes to yourself. At this point in time, I want something to happen. At this point in time, I want something to happen. You also will have the visual waveform as we see it here. So this waveform, you can look for where it gets smaller or larger and use those as ways to identify key parts in your audio.